In the fall of 1984, Mark St. John stood on a soundstage filming the video for Heaven's on Fire, one of the biggest hits of Kiss's entire 1980s career, a song that helped make the band's Animalize album one of its most successful non-makeup era releases. It would be the only Kiss video Mark St. John ever appeared in. Before that same year ended, his hands, the same hands that had just helped record one of the era's most talked about hard rock guitar performances, would betray him so completely that he would never play another full show as a member of Kiss again. To understand how a guitarist's career could rise and collapse within a single calendar year, leaving a legacy that remains genuinely contested even decades later, you have to go back to the spring of 1984, when Mark St. John got the job that was supposed to be the biggest break of his life. Mark St. John was born Mark Leslie Norton on February 7, 1956 in Hollywood, California, in the same city where he would later build the reputation that eventually led him to Kiss. He built a reputation in the years before joining Kiss as a technically gifted guitarist whose flashy, fast-playing style reflected the influence of Van Halen and the broader wave of virtuosic rock guitarists who had come to define hard rock in the early 1980s. In 1984, St. John was brought into Kiss as the band's third official guitarist, stepping into a lineup that had already weathered the departure of founding guitarist Ace Frehley in 1982 and the short, turbulent stint of his immediate predecessor, Vinnie Vincent, a transition covered in detail elsewhere in this series. By the time St. John joined, Kiss had already abandoned its trademark makeup and costumes, and the band, led by Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, was looking for a stable, reliable guitarist who could help the group settle into a new identity after years of lineup instability that had followed the band's dramatic and commercially uneven experiments earlier in the decade. The search for St. John's predecessor's replacement had not been an easy one for Kiss's leadership. Simmons and Stanley had spent much of the early 1980s working through a period of genuine internal disagreement about the band's direction, with Simmons increasingly focused on outside projects, including film work, while Stanley remained more singularly committed to keeping Kiss itself moving forward as a functioning, actively recording and touring act. Vinnie Vincent's brief tenure had ended amid exactly the kind of interpersonal and financial friction the band hoped to avoid going forward, and St. John arrived specifically as an attempt to find a guitarist who could offer both technical skill and a more stable, lower conflict working relationship with the band's two remaining founding members. St. John's arrival coincided with the recording of Animalize, released in September 1984, and the album that would become his only studio credit with the band. Animalize re-established Kiss as one of the world's top arena metal acts, and St. John's playing energetic and technically sharp in a style that fit the era's guitar-driven hard rock sound was widely credited by fans and critics as a meaningful part of what made the record connect with an audience that had grown increasingly drawn to the fast, technically ambitious guitar playing, popularized by acts like Van Halen earlier in the decade. The album marked a clear commercial rebound for Kiss following a stretch of the early 1980s that had included the poorly received concept album Music from The Elder and the band's uncertain transition away from its original makeup era identity, a period covered in detail elsewhere in this series. Animalize's success suggested that the band's decision to embrace a more straightforward, guitar-forward hard rock sound, paired with a new guitarist capable of delivering that sound convincingly, had been the right strategic choice, even though the specific guitarist responsible for much of that sound would not remain with the band long enough to fully capitalize on the album's success. The album produced the hit single Heaven's on Fire, which became one of Kiss's most enduring songs of the decade and received heavy rotation on MTV during a period when the network's programming decisions could make or break a rock band's commercial trajectory. The music video for the song became the only Kiss video St. John ever appeared in, a detail that, in hindsight, marked both the high point and the near total extent of his visible career with the band. For fans watching that video upon its release in 1984, there was no indication whatsoever that the guitarist featured so prominently and so energetically, and it would be gone from the band's touring lineup within a matter of months. A gap between the public image of a band member at the peak of visibility and the private reality of a career already beginning to unravel that recurs throughout the history of rock music more broadly. But that played out with unusual speed and finality in that John's specific case. The trouble began almost immediately after the album's release, right around the time Kiss was preparing to launch a worldwide tour in support of Animalize. St. John was diagnosed with a condition called Reiter's syndrome, a form of reactive arthritis that causes painful inflammation, in his case affecting his hands and arms severely enough to prevent him from playing guitar. Reiter's syndrome, now more commonly referred to in medical literature as reactive arthritis, typically develops in response to an infection elsewhere in the body and can cause the joints, particularly in the hands, wrists, and feet, to become inflamed, swollen, and painful, sometimes severely enough to significantly limit fine motor function for extended periods. For a working guitarist, and specifically for a guitarist whose entire value to a touring hard rock band rested on his ability to play fast, technically demanding parts night after night, a condition that attacked exactly that physical capability represented close to the worst possible diagnosis his career could have produced. The timing could hardly have been worse, arriving just as Kiss needed him most, in the middle of a major touring commitment built around an album he had just helped create, one that was performing well commercially and that the band was eager to support with a full supporting tour. With St. John unable to perform, Kiss brought in guitarist Bruce Kulick to fill in for the tour, a musician who would go on to become one of the longest-serving guitarists in the band's history, remaining with Kiss for over a decade after St. John's departure. St. John did manage to perform one full concert with the band, along with portions of a handful of additional shows, moments that represented nearly the entirety of his live performing career as a member of Kiss. As his condition failed to improve enough to allow him to return to full-time touring, the band made the difficult decision to move forward with Kulick as a permanent replacement, a transition that took shape over the following months as it became clear St. John's health would not allow him to resume his role. The speed of that transition, from a guitarist appearing in a hit music video to a guitarist permanently sidelined by a medical condition within the span of a single touring cycle, left St. John with little time to process or adjust to what was happening to his career, a circumstance that differed sharply from the more gradual, drawn-out departures that defined most other lineup changes in Kiss's history. The way that transition unfolded said something about the relationships involved, even amid a painful professional loss for St. John personally. Bruce Kulick, the guitarist stepping into the position St. John was being forced to leave, later described the awkwardness of the situation candidly, recalling that the two of them used to warm up backstage together during the period when both were technically part of the touring operation, and that despite the underlying competition for the same job, he made a deliberate effort to keep John comfortable rather than treat the situation as an adversarial contest. When Paul Stanley spoke publicly about St. John's departure years later, following St. John's death, He described St. John as having tried his best to become the guitarist Kiss, and its fans needed expressed pride in their work together on Animalize, and said St. John had been gracious in accepting that a full return to live performing would not happen, remaining supportive of Kulick throughout what Stanley called a genuinely difficult transition for everyone involved. St. John's official tenure as a full member of Kiss ended by late 1984, making him, in terms of pure calendar time, one of the shortest-serving guitarists in the band's history, despite having contributed to an album that many fans continue to regard as one of Kiss's strongest releases from its non-makeup era. His health reportedly improved substantially after he left the demands of a touring rock band behind, a detail that suggests the specific physical stress of nightly touring performances may have played some role in aggravating his condition beyond the underlying diagnosis itself. Though no formal medical study of his specific case appears to exist in the public record to confirm that connection definitively. He went on to co-found a new act called White Tiger in 1986, alongside former Black Sabbath singer David Donato, becoming, according to some retrospective accounts, the first former Kiss guitarist to release a studio album of his own following his departure from the band, a notable milestone given how many guitarists would eventually pass through the group's lineup over the following decades. White Tiger did not achieve significant commercial success, and St. John's career after leaving Kiss never again reached the visibility of his brief run with the band, a pattern that has played out for several musicians whose time in a globally famous act represented a career peak that later solo or side projects struggled to match. St. John remained connected to the broader Kiss community in the years that followed his departure, at one point recording an unreleased demo alongside former Kiss drummer Peter Criss, a collaboration between two musicians who had each left the band under very different circumstances. Criss, through years of internal conflict and substance struggles that unfolded gradually over multiple years, St. John, through a sudden medical emergency entirely outside his control that unfolded within a matter of months. That demo was never formally released, and few public details exist about the specific material the two musicians worked on together, though its existence reflects the kind of informal, ongoing relationships that often persist among musicians who share a common history with the same band, even years after their individual departures. In 2003, St. John released an all-instrumental solo album titled Magic Bullet Theory, a project that allowed him to demonstrate his guitar playing directly, without the commercial pressures or lineup politics that had defined his time with Kiss nearly 2 decades earlier. He continued to make occasional public appearances as a guest speaker at Kiss fan conventions throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, keeping a visible, if modest, connection to the band and its fan base, even as his own career never again reached the commercial heights of his brief run with Kiss. These convention appearances gave longtime fans one of their few ongoing opportunities to hear directly from St. John about his time in the band, since he rarely appeared in mainstream music press coverage once his active recording career slowed. St. John's life took a difficult turn in the final months before his death, one that stood in sharp contrast to the relatively stable, if quiet, decades he had spent since leaving Kiss. On September 14, 2006, he was incarcerated at Theo Lacey Jail in Orange County, California, after being charged with possession of drug paraphernalia, attempted destruction of evidence, and resisting arrest. Theo Lacey Jail, operated by the Orange County Sheriff's Department, has itself faced public scrutiny over the years regarding conditions and treatment of inmates in various cases unrelated to St. John, context that has informed how some observers have interpreted the claims that later circulated about St. John's time there, though no independent official investigation into St. John's specific treatment during his incarceration has ever been made public or formally concluded. According to accounts that circulated after his death, drawing on information St. John reportedly shared with people close to him during that final stretch of his life, he suffered severe headaches and body aches in the months following his release from custody, and told his girlfriend at the time that he believed those symptoms were the direct result of a physical beating he experienced during his time in jail. The specific medical care St. John received, if any, while incarcerated has never been publicly documented in detail, and no formal complaint or lawsuit connected to his treatment during that particular incarceration appears anywhere in the public record available today. After his release, according to those same accounts, St. John did not seek medical treatment for his declining condition, reportedly because he lacked medical insurance at the time, a circumstance that left his worsening symptoms unaddressed by a doctor in the months leading up to his death. For a musician whose career had once depended on a major touring band's health resources and professional support system, including access to consistent medical attention when his writer's syndrome first emerged in 1984, the isolation of his final months, managing a serious and worsening medical condition without insurance or consistent medical oversight, stood in stark contrast to the early, well-documented medical attention his original diagnosis had received more than 2 decades earlier while he was still an active member of KISS. Mark St. John died on April 5, 2007, at the age of 51, closing out a story that began with one of the most promising guitar hires in KISS's post-makeup era history, and ended in circumstances that remain genuinely disputed to this day. The official finding from the coroner's office attributed his death to a brain hemorrhage, brought on, according to that finding, by an accidental overdose of methamphetamine. That official conclusion sat in direct tension with the account offered by friends close to St. John in the years and months before his death, who maintained instead that the physical trauma from his 2006 incarceration, left untreated due to his lack of insurance and his own reluctance to seek care, was the true underlying cause of the decline that ultimately killed him. Both accounts have circulated publicly in the years since his death, without any single, universally accepted resolution between the coroner's official finding and the alternative account offered by people who knew him personally during his final months, and no additional forensic review or follow-up investigation appears to have been conducted in the years since to settle the discrepancy one way or the other. Neither version of events has been definitively proven or disproven in any public forum, and this account presents both because the available public record does not allow for a confident conclusion favoring one over the other. What can be said with confidence, based on everything currently available in the public record, is that St. John's health entered a serious and sustained decline sometime after his September 2006 incarceration, and that he died within roughly 7 months of his release from custody, at a point in his life when he had already spent more than 2 decades navigating the aftermath of a career-defining injury that had ended his time in one of hard rock's most successful bands. In the days following his death, St. John's former bandmates spoke publicly about his passing, offering statements that, taken together, painted a picture of a musician whose brief tenure had nonetheless left a genuine impression on the people he worked alongside. Paul Stanley's tribute reflected specifically on their creative collaboration on Animalize and on St. John's graciousness during the transition that ended his time in the band. Language that suggested Stanley had continued to think about St. John's situation with some degree of regret over the years since his departure. Gene Simmons offered a shorter, more direct statement, calling St. John a great guitarist and a good man, and saying he would be missed. A comparatively brief tribute that nonetheless confirmed the band's collective decision to publicly acknowledge St. John's passing, rather than let it go unremarked, given how little time he had ultimately spent as an official member. Eric Singer, who joined Kiss as its drummer years after St. John's departure, but who had become part of the band's extended history by the time of St. John's death, added his own tribute, describing St. John as a talented guitarist who had earned his place in the band's history, despite the brevity of his time as an official member. A comment from someone who had never personally worked alongside St. John, but who understood, from within the band's own internal culture, the significance of what St. John had contributed during his short time there. Looking back at Mark St. John's full trajectory more than 2 decades after his departure from Kiss and nearly 2 decades after his death, the story carries a kind of double misfortune that sets it apart from most of the other transitions in Kiss's history covered elsewhere in this series. His departure was not driven by creative conflict, financial disputes, or personal friction with his bandmates, the forces that shaped most of the other lineup changes across Kiss's 5-decade history, and that dominate the more commonly told stories about the band's revolving cast of musicians. It was driven entirely by a sudden disabling physical condition that struck at the exact skill his position in the band depended on, ending his tenure almost as quickly as it began. And more than 2 decades later, the circumstances of his eventual death remained similarly unresolved, caught between an official medical finding and the alternative account offered by the people who knew him best in his final months, a gap in the public record that has never been fully closed. John's name rarely comes up in broader retrospectives of Kiss's history, overshadowed by guitarists who served longer tenures or left under more publicly documented circumstances, and largely absent from the kind of career-spanning documentaries and retrospective interviews that have kept other former members' stories in circulation among fans. His actual body of work with the band, however brief, remains audible on one of the most successful Kiss albums of the 1980s, a permanent record of what his hands were capable of before those same hands, and later his health more broadly, were taken from him by circumstances largely outside his control. First, by an autoimmune condition no one could have predicted, and later, by a chain of events beginning in a county jail that has never been fully explained. If you want to understand more about the other guitarists who passed through Kiss's lineup during its most turbulent transitional years, including Vinnie Vincent's brief and contentious tenure immediately before Sainting, John's arrival, and the fuller story of how Bruce Kulick came to permanently take over the role and remain with the band for more than a decade afterward, the rest of this series covers those chapters in detail. Subscribe to stay with it.